Guyana has rapidly become the fastest-growing country in the world, however. Behind this development, there is a single company pulling the strings, raising significant questions. Who is this oil company that controls the country? Is this wealth being distributed to the population, or is the country sinking into corruption? It seems that Guyana is reverting to colonization. That's what I'll explain in today's video. With 11 billion barrels of oil reserves, Guyana holds an astonishing amount, representing 70% of Brazil's oil reserves in a much smaller country. Guyana decided to utilize its wealth by granting exploration rights to foreign companies. While other countries allow foreign oil and gas companies to operate in the industry, none have the volume and dominance that ExxonMobil exercises in Guyana. The situation around this topic is not as straightforward as it may seem. It's not as black and white as it appears. Many surveys were conducted in Guyana's territory in search of black gold, but it wasn't until 2015 that the massive oil reserves were discovered. And guess who achieved this feat? ExxonMobil. From that moment on, the company knew it had a sea of money to explore. But don't think this discovery was a coincidence. Few things involving this much money are coincidences, much more than you can imagine. To understand the context, we need to know a bit about this major oil company that found the golden goose. ExxonMobil is a giant in the industry and had been operating in South America long before Guyana discovered its oil. One of the countries where it operated was Venezuela, the same country that now wants to annex over half of Guyana's territory. Venezuela, under the socialist dictatorship, nationalized its oil production in 2007, affecting foreign companies like British Petroleum, Chevron, and of course ExxonMobil. Overnight, ExxonMobil lost a significant market share in the commodity. Turning its attention to Guyana, ExxonMobil conducted explorations and research for 8 years, hoping to find another Venezuela. In 2015 it succeeded. That was one of the most significant discoveries of black gold in recent history. Despite the discovery, the oil still belonged and belongs to Guyana, owned by its people. Then came the second phase of the company's billion-dollar venture, convincing the Guyanese people that ExxonMobil should be the one to exploit the resource because it would be better for everyone. Believe it or not, convincing them wasn't a very difficult task. Why? Because ExxonMobil is a giant, while Guyana was a small, irrelevant country with no strength to compete with such a powerful and century-old multinational. It conquered the country without any hindrance. In a way, the United States conquered Guyana purely through the power of influence. Not long ago, American journalist Amy Westervelt wrote a controversial article stating that ExxonMobil used corruption to secure oil exploration in Guyana. Moreover, with its immense power, the company allegedly exercised absurd control over the small country's government. According to her, it became difficult to distinguish where the oil company ends and the government begins. Accusations go further, claiming that Exxon executives are friends with Guyana's president Irfan Ali, and that the vice president regularly holds press conferences to defend the oil company. There are even claims that Exxon influenced the country's environmental agency to turn a blind eye to exploration platforms, which is a delicate issue. We all know that an accident during oil and gas exploration can have catastrophic consequences for human life, as well as the local fauna and flora. Exxon's own environmental impact assessments indicate that a disaster in Guyana could send oil to the beaches of 14 different Caribbean islands, most of which depend on fishing and tourism, and all of which could hold Guyana responsible for the damages. The controversy over ExxonMobil, allegedly operating without proper supervision from the environmental agency, is making waves in the country. In the most optimistic view, there is lax oversight. However, the company claims it is committed to developing Guyana's resources responsibly to maximize value for all stakeholders, including the government and the people of Guyana. Amy Westervelt went even further. In her accusatory article, according to her, ExxonMobil engaged in manipulating the local public opinion. Firstly, it allegedly bribed journalists to speak well of the company, or at least avoid criticism, with favored journalists primarily covering environmental issues. The company also acted swiftly to win the hearts and minds not only of state employees but also other members of civil society. One of Exxon's initial major public investments in Guyana was sponsoring the Caribbean Premier League, a popular regional cricket tournament, and the country's cricket team, the Amazon Warriors. Players proudly display ExxonMobil on the front of their uniforms. The company also contributed to broadcasting cricket games on TV. What better way to win a country's heart than investing in sports-related propaganda, especially one involving sports? A simple technique used to control masses for a long time. The policy of bread and circuses. Whenever possible, the oil company reminds the public of its sponsorship and conservation efforts in cricket. A marketing video the company released last year is a perfect example. It starts at the main cricket stadium, with the first minute and a half focusing on the company's investments in sports. Then, ExxonMobil's public relations leader hits the streets, randomly engaging people in conversations about oil exploration in the country. How can one not have positive impressions of the company after such efforts? And the cricket sponsorship must be paying off because this year, Exxon significantly increased its investment in the sport, announcing funding for a new stadium costing almost $20 million. It will host sports events and concerts in an area that will coincidentally house a massive oil and gas export port. In an interview with the BBC, the country's president, Irfan Ali, admitted that the deals favored the multinational more than the nation. He stated, "The agreement could have been better for Guyana. Exxon got a good deal signed by the previous government, but contract compliance is crucial. We can't go back and renegotiate. After all, there wouldn't be much he could do to backtrack either. Exxon, even though it is private, represents the interests of the U.S. government to some extent. The superpower is delighted to have one of its major companies operating the great wealth of South America. It's no wonder they now conduct military exercises with the local army. But is all this oil extraction money benefiting the population? Is the GDP growth translating into a better quality of life? Or is Guyana succumbing to the oil curse? The oil curse is a socio-economic phenomenon observed in many resource-rich countries, especially those with abundant oil. Hence, it's also known as the paradox of plenty. A country wins the natural resources lottery but doesn't guarantee its full development because it becomes dependent on fluctuating oil prices that can go from heaven to hell in a matter of days. A pandemic or war breaks out and boom, everything turns to dust. There's also the potential issue of the oil curse triggering the so-called Dutch disease. In this case, the disease is not a health condition, but more an observation of a historical phenomenon that began mainly in the 1960s in the Netherlands. It's a phenomenon where the abundance of revenues from natural resources strengthens the local currency, making non-oil-related exports less competitive internationally, leading to deindustrialization over time. Deindustrialization caused by the Dutch disease can reduce economic growth, increase unemployment, and cause wage declines. The country's trade balance can also be massively affected as it becomes dependent on a single item. And when that item is not in demand, it cannot compensate for losses with other products. The oil curse is also strongly linked to poor governance and corruption, especially in underdeveloped or developing countries. I don't need to explain much, because discovering staggering amounts of oil would lead politicians to steal more, excluding the population from the gains derived from the natural resource. They fill their pockets instead of making the country a rich and prosperous nation as it naturally has the potential to be. This aspect of the curse tends to lead to an increase in social inequality. Venezuela is again a good example of a country hit hard by the paradox of plenty. It was once one of the most prosperous economies in Latin America. However, oil dependence and poor economic management led to a severe economic crisis, hyperinflation, scarcity of basic goods, and political instability. We know well what Venezuela is like today. Its case is so notable that all Latin American countries use Venezuela as an example not to be followed. Angola and Nigeria present similar problems, albeit on a smaller scale. Both have experienced excellent GDP growth for years, but these oil and gas-rich countries have not reached the pinnacle of social development. So, is Guyana managing to escape the oil curse? Since the discovery in 2015, the Guyanese government has been promising that black gold will transform the fortune of one of the poorest countries in South America. In part, this has already happened and continues to unfold at an almost unbelievable pace. In 2022 alone, Guyana's economy grew by 62%, the highest rate on the planet. According to the World Bank, it is expected to grow by almost 40% by 2023. In mid-2022, Local authorities announced that they had, for the first time, tapped into the sovereign fund holding the royalties paid by oil producers, specifically ExxonMobil. It didn't take long for these royalties to reach billions of dollars. By 2027, Exxon and its partners, Hess and the Chinese CNOOC, intend to pump 1.2 million barrels per day from the Guyanese seabed, making the country by far the largest per capita oil producer in the world. President Irfan Ali asserts that the oil boom will finance a development plan focusing on infrastructure and education for the country's 790,000 inhabitants. However, Guyana is a more complex country than you might imagine, with ethnic conflicts in politics. President Irfan was largely supported by the country's Indian descendants, a significant portion of the local population, yet many communities, especially those linked to Afro-Guyanese opposition areas, complain that money and contracts are already flowing to government supporters. They allege that the ruling party is installing allies in bodies meant to govern the nation's new wealth. Authorities deny these claims. In recent years, the government and opposition clashed on various issues, from how the country's growing accounts should be audited to major appointments. However, perhaps the most central dispute has been over how to govern the Natural Resources Fund, the sovereign fund holding Guyana's oil royalties. Among the opposition's concerns with current legislation is that they don't have the right to appoint representatives to its board. This is a significant concern in a country with a history of endemic corruption. In addition to parliamentary opposition, Afro-Guyanese communities took to the streets to protest the government's alleged unfair distribution of resources, claiming that Indian communities are receiving more. The opposition strongly argues that the government's generous use of cash donations, often administered by local bureaucrats, promotes corruption and political favoritism. President Irfan Ali consistently denies any bribery and says that donation programs are subject to federal audit. Externally, the government is keen to adopt an inclusive rhetoric, but the dispute over resources is often more subtle than a battle over sacks of money. Under the previous government, many state-owned sugar-producing rural properties were closed or downsized amid falling productivity. This angered the Indian community, whose members make up the majority of workers on these properties. Since the government changed hands, now supported by Indian descendants, roles have begun to reverse. Many Afro-Guyanese descendants complain that sugar-producing communities are receiving significant investments while their own neighborhoods are neglected. The feeling of inequality is also fueled by the fact that the country's major entrepreneurs are Indo-Guyanese, giving their successors a significant advantage in profiting directly from the rapidly growing oil sector. In raw numbers, it can be said that Guyana's income level has risen. In 2015, the country had a per capita GDP of just over $5,000. According to the World Bank, by 2022, it was already $18,000. In half a decade, the country's income has practically quadrupled. Therefore, it would be incorrect to say that the wealth exploited by ExxonMobil is not returning to the population. In terms of income and quality of life, it is. Life in Guyana is unquestionably improving, but achievements cannot erase mistakes. ExxonMobil's exploration process still carries a dubious character, where any environmental disaster would likely fall on the country's shoulders rather than the company's. Moreover, ethnic and racial divisions threaten the fair distribution of wealth that belongs to all the country's people. For now, the oil curse does not seem to be shaking the country. What really troubles Guyana at the moment is Venezuela. The curious thing is that Venezuela expelled ExxonMobil when it nationalized its oil production. Now that Guyana is swimming in oil explored by Exxon, Venezuela wants to annex 70% of the country. But to annex Guyana, Venezuelans will have to face ExxonMobil's influence with the United States government. A company that buys a country is not easily defeated. Currently, it is common to see news presenting only one perspective, manipulating our perception. It was to show both sides of the coin that I created this channel. The truth needs to be told, so I am very happy with every like and every comment. To support our work and help us produce more videos like this, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel, if possible. Leave a comment and share this video with a friend. Now, do you want to know why people are collapsing in the middle of the streets in China? The reason will amaze you. That's what I tell you in the video that appears on your screen now. For this video, that's it. A big hug and good business. Do you know which business model offers high profit margins, immense scalability, and requires low initial investment? The startup market specializing in software development is the optimal choice to bring together all these advantages. However, the only place where you will truly find a highly scalable service that demands low investment is with Roadmap. Roadmap has global experience providing consulting and developing apps for startups in the United States, Europe, and Latin America, making it by far the best option for new entrepreneurs. If you want to venture into the premier market, contact Roadmap right away through the website www.roadmap.co/home or via email at contact@roadmap.co.